So I wanted to talk about this debate about the UK riots on immigration. If you could divide people into two camps, it's more or less the anti-mass immigration folks and the people defending mass immigration. But I couldn't help but notice that Lonerbox was conspicuously silent when the topic of groomer gangs was brought up.
Yeah, I would rather sign that and perhaps prevent some grooming games and stuff. But that grooming gangs, Jack and I are saying this is a culmination of many issues, including the grooming gangs, including the violence that has occurred.
I found this notable because Lonerbox has previously made a video on Sargon of Akkad, critiquing his claim that it's a certain type of immigrant that are disproportionately taking part in these grooming gangs. So it seemed like the perfect opportunity to refute this dangerous misinformation that mass immigration and grooming gangs are somewhat linked, especially since Callum was there, who worked on Sargon of Akkad's network, the Lotus Eaters.
But when it comes to people from Pakistan, it's about the fucked up views they have about age of consent, for example. The crimes are much worse in that particular community.
Granted, during this clip, Lonerbox had just joined the call and was still getting his setup right. But you would imagine that he would jump at this golden opportunity to confront this dangerous misinformation, either by going back to what Callum had just said, or to talk about it when Lauren Southern broached the subject. But Lonerbox remains conspicuously silent. In this video, he mainly critiques a study cited by Sargon of Akkad and a lot of mainstream newspapers.
Carl, that's his name, loves studies. Or at the very least, he loves studies so long as he thinks they've proven the thing he already believed.
Now, credit where credit's due. Lonerbox does a good job of debunking that particular study. And his videos are quite funny. I like his sense of humour.
But if there's one study Sargon and in fact the entire who's who of internet white nationalists, are particularly attached to is one on grooming gangs.
And to be clear, he does do a good job of rebuking the study that this headline is based off. But just because you've shown that that study was particularly iffy doesn't mean you've disproven the claim that Asians are disproportionately represented in grooming gangs.
I'd also recommend you look up Ella Cobain. She's kind of a leading figure in this area, and she's done an insane amount of work around tackling these kind of crimes. I wouldn't have been able to make this video without her research, so definitely give her a look if you want to know more.
Thanks for the suggestion. And I did indeed look her up, and she's an interesting figure. But we'll come back to her.
Research has found that Group CSC offenders are most commonly white.
Note the weird phrasing of most commonly white. White people make up 80% of the UK, so that's not a surprising figure.
Some studies suggest an overrepresentation of Black and Asian. Not enough to conclude that this is representative of all offending, okay?
Some studies do find this overrepresentation, but we can just ignore them.
He loves studies so long as he thinks they've proven the thing he already believed.
But let's go back to the aforementioned Ella Cobain, who also talks about this report. Once you do some quick digging on Ella Cobain, two things become abundantly obvious. One is that she's an activist and ideologue, and two, she has a massive forehead. One thing is for sure, there is an overrepresentation of forehead on her face.
In 2020, the Home Office released a report, which is kind of popularly known as the Grooming Gangs report. And that report looked at the best available evidence overall, and it concluded that the majority of such perpetrators were white. And to be clear, that is not, as a lot of people often assume, just because the UK is majority white. It was because there was no kind of reliable, generalizable evidence, i.e. sort of representative at national level, to back up these deeply racialized stereotypes that have become so widespread.
What is that word salad? So most commonly white doesn't mean most commonly white because there's no generalizable evidence that this is representative at a national level. What are you even trying to say, you fucking idiot? This is bizarre, since all the data collected by the Home Office seems to show an overrepresentation of Asians. Asians make up around 9% of the population. But in the studies we see a 14%, 19%, 50%, 28% representation. So while they want you to concentrate on this spurious claim that whites are the most common perpetrators, they aren't an overrepresentation, which Asians are. And I do think this is being extremely charitable, because we're comparing Asians. But let's be honest, I don't think it's the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Indians involved in these grooming gangs. I think breaking it down by nationality would reveal an even starker overrepresentation. The Home Office tries to blame this on the media's overrepresentation of Asian perpetrators, even though their evidence just contradicts that. But they can cite this paper, it's by Ella Cockbain herself, where she informs us that Muslim grooming gangs have become a staple of far-right propaganda. Okay, it's just those far-rightists. Let's just ignore all those studies. In fact, Cockbain is mentioned in the Home Office report a total of 35 times. You'd think that would be something you'd want to disclose when you're talking about this. But the key findings of the report on ethnicity put it succinctly, that there is an overrepresentation found in these studies. While the majority are white, there's an overrepresentation of Asians. She takes issue with the phrase Muslim pedophilia because, they're not prepubescent girls, so they're technically not pedophiles, and they're not exclusively attracted to minors. By this same logic, technically, Epstein wasn't a pedophile. And we have to be precise here because we don't want to offend these people that were raping underage girls. That's really the priority here. That's what we should be focused on. I also found this 2018 study that found 83% of those prosecuted were Muslims. A whole 1% off the data that Lonerbox critiqued Sargon of Akkad from drawing from. One of the methods that they used for this study was to analyze all the media headlines of these cases and take the name of the perpetrators to determine their ethnicity. But as Lonerbox has astutely pointed out with this type of study,
and I'm guessing what they did was that they just got newspaper articles and just counted the names, which would be a good method if every single group case of group child exploitation got headlines, which is not the case. So.
And they do acknowledge this potential bias that less newsworthy trials might not get headlines and therefore be excluded from the study. But they also determined it's very unlikely that the high proportion of Muslim names identified in their data is due to the exclusion of a large number of non-Muslim offenders. They determined that Muslim and Pakistani proportions of the local population are powerful variables in explaining the level of child grooming in the area.
But there's never been any strong evidence to suggest that there's like a disproportionate number of Muslims doing this compared to white people.
There's never been any evidence, apart from all the studies that have been done, including the one that you just pulled up on your screen.
But there's never been any strong evidence to suggest that there's like a disproportionate number of Muslims doing this compared to white people. Some studies suggest an overrepresentation of Black and Asian.
Ugh, that's awkward. While the evidence may be flawed in some ways, due to the nature of the crime being committed and the difficulty in collecting this type of data, flawed evidence is better than no evidence, which Lonerbox and this weirdo Ella Cockbain are completely bereft of. In fact, any articles or papers that try to refute the claim that Muslims or British Pakistanis are disproportionately representative of these groomer gangs, even Lonerbox's video, always tie back to this Ella Cockbain and her massive forehead.